My name is Kat Buxton, and I think I know many of you, but I'm not sure I know all of you because it's hard to know who's even on here with this interesting format. I think it's been a couple of minutes, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And actually, the first thing I wanted to share was not this show, but a little video. Many of you may have seen the flower and bread video. This exercise was designed by Dee Dee Pursehouse and a high school science teacher at Hartford High. And it's now been done all around the world. And I love to start my presentations with this. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit play and start this video. Actually want to make sure that I clicked the sound because you'll want to hear it. So let's get started with that. Sorry, technical difficulties. My hands are better in the soil.
A healthy landscape. It's sand, silt, clay.
Try that again.
We're looking at two landscapes here. On the red plate, this is a degraded landscape. It's flour as a stand-in for a degraded landscape, which is dirt, sand, silt, and clay. Broken up rocks. On the green plate is bread, and it's a stand-in for a healthy landscape. It's sand, silt, clay, and biology. Super important. Let's see what happens when we rain on these landscapes. Pouring water into a rain cloud, of course, and the rain cloud is causing erosion. The rain is causing erosion. We see some runoff. There appears to be flooding. The color of that water indicates that the soil itself, or the landscape, is now a part of the water system. We have dry places all over the landscape, but yet there's flooding. This seems to be flooding and drought at the same time. If we were a plant in this landscape and there was a drought and places did not get water, it would be dry at the bottom. So let's see. We find a totally dry plate on the bottom. So if we're a plant in this landscape, our roots would not have just gotten a drink. We would be thirsty. Flooding, drought in the same place, poor water quality. If you were farming or gardening in this landscape or adding any type of household chemicals to this landscape, those would now be in the waterway. Let's see what happens when we rain on a healthy landscape. On the bread. The water is infiltrating into the sponge of the soil. It's soaking in like a sponge. Those pore spaces that hold the bread out are happening because yeast is the magic ingredient in bread, which is the biology in bread. That's what makes air spaces those organisms breathe. Those pores are held together in landscapes by the goose glues, snots, and slimes that are produced by biological soil organisms that live all throughout the soil landscape. Let's see what happens when we rain twice as much on this landscape, since we didn't see any flooding from the first rainstorm. These pore spaces make up about half of the space of soil, and they are where the air is in soil. It's where water can infiltrate into soil, and that air and water, along with photosynthesis and the sugars made by plants, sustain microbial life in the soil. So twice the amount of water, and we still have no flooding in this landscape. I'm going to pour a little more because I'm really trying to reach saturation here. Saturation will happen when we start to see water flow out from the bottom of this landscape, indicating that the water is going through the soil to the base layer Soil is a filter, healthy soil. Biological organisms and chemical interactions with those organisms in the soil, in these pore spaces, in the sponge, actually clean water. If you had to live in these landscapes, would you choose the flour or the bread if you were a farmer? If you were growing plants of any kind, you would likely choose the bread. The bread is wet all the way through. We have full saturation. If these landscapes were out in hot, hot, sunny conditions for days after this rainstorm, this one would evaporate and get covered with a hard, crusty surface, would not take in water the next time it rained. This one would get a little stale on the outside, so to speak, because it's bread, and down in the middle you would still have some moisture, so organisms and plants in this landscape would still be able to get a drink. If you had to build a house in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread. Your house here might be in the waterway. If you had to get water from natural sources in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread because you might be able to find it after it rained and you would want to drink it, as opposed to this right after a rainstorm.
That was flour and bread. I hope that translated well for you. And just in case you're wondering, the brown layer in the middle of the bread was not peanut butter. It was actually a little bit of an end heel that I didn't know was in there when I made the video. But c'est la vie. We'll make them better in the future. That is one of my favorite activities. I do that with kids and people of all ages when I start my presentations, because it makes a great reference to go back to. So I am Kat Buxton. I run a business called Grow More, Waste Less. I'm the co-founder of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and a board member of the Soil Carbon Coalition. I wear a lot of hats in our community, and I'm so proud to be a member of this community. I'm excited to share with you this relatively new presentation, Principles Feed Practice, Building the Soil Sponge in Our Backyards and Communities to Meet Climate Change, Manage Extremes, and to Stay Well. Humans, we are something else. So I'm not going to read my slides to you because I assume that you're reading those as well, but I can say that soil is incredibly important, and the more I learn about it, the more I realize that so much of what we need now and what we need in our future, and not just us but every other being on the planet, is greatly determined by the health of our soil, and we get to decide what kind of impact we are going to have on landscapes as humans. The world has over 60 years of topsoil left, according to the United Nations in 2014, and that has been reiterated in more recent reports by the UN. We are losing topsoil at an amazing rate. This photo that we're seeing on the screen is a picture that was taken by my colleague Peter Donovan from the Soil Carbon Coalition. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to turn my video off because I just got a message that my internet connection is not great. So no more video, and I'm going to keep on going, except I wanted to go backwards. Sorry. The world has 60 years of topsoil left, and that we're going to be in trouble if that if we continue our current rate of action with the way that we manage our soil. As this slide shows, that according to the Soybean and Corn Digest of 2017, for every bushel of corn that we harvest in the United States, grown just like this in this picture taken by Peter Donovan, In just 2018, where the corn is planted right up to the waterway, every bushel of corn that is harvested, we lose a bushel of soil. And you can almost see that happening in this still photo. It's as if the Dust Bowl never happened. We're planting right up to our waterways again. And I want to say that this is not the fault of farmers. This is not the fault of people managing land. This is a part of our economic system, and we can change that. Globally, soil degradation is astronomical. The red areas on this map are indicating very degraded soil, and in some cases, those are places that are now deserts that used to be biodiverse ecosystems. This is very real, and this is very connected to climate change. Lauren's presentation was wonderful and really mapped out some of those systems that are managing our planet as we understand them. And what we're learning is that soil and biomass are incredibly important holds for carbon and water in our ecosystem. And we broke it, but we can fix it. And it's happening all over. The fixing, and that's what gives me hope. This particular map is from the Soil Carbon Coalition.org website. You can go on there and find a lot of these different maps, very fascinating, and some little movies that you can play to show the change in time over the crop insurance indemnities that have been given out in the last 15 years. This particular map in 2014 really stood out to me because it's showing places where farmers, landowners have gotten crop insurance indemnities for both excessive moisture and drought in the same place at the same time. This is showing us that what's happening globally is also happening here. Just like the flower on the plate, we have flooding and drought in the same place at the same time. And that is likely due to a lack of biological diversity in our soil. Soil is alive. This slide is showing us, it's a pretty famous slide, you may have seen it before, an estimated $800 million in infrastructure damage caused by Tropical Storm Irene. The brown that we're seeing in Long Island Sound there is Vermont's dirt roads and our topsoil. That's where a lot of it went, and we can't get that back. That $800 million in infrastructure damage does not include 1 penny for soil health or water quality. These are some pictures from around Vermont, some from Tropical Storm Irene. I'm sure you've seen many of them. They're all over the internet, and many of us experience these visuals ourselves in our own communities. And it's not just Tropical Storm Irene. Every time we get rain now, it's intense, and it's hard to manage. The bottom right picture there is showing our school gardens at Thetford Elementary School, and about 8 foot below that center part where the water is going down is a drain. So our entire schoolyard flooded in just a rainstorm. This was not even predicted to be a big rainstorm. This is the kind of water management that we have ahead of us. According to the University of Vermont Climate Change and Agriculture Program, headed up by Joshua Faulkner, you can go to the website. The link is there on the bottom right of the slide to show you all of this research and more. And I'm not going to leave the slide up long enough for you to be able to read it, but all of the slides from this presentation will be available on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website, in addition to the recorded webinar that we're having right now. On the top right in bullet points are the summary of the things that we can expect, what we've seen, what we can expect: wetter springs, more common, very heavy rains, longer summer dry spells and droughts. I know farmers that are watering in September when they've never watered in September before. More farmers are having to invest in irrigation equipment to be able to manage the extremes in hydration and drought. And that's a big cost, and those things are often plastic, which is also another concern for us. We're having warmer winters. This one is exemplary for that. Here we are on March 22nd. There's hardly any snow on the ground, and I'd really like to be outside. And we're having longer growing seasons, but they're not really predictable or reliable which is actually making it so that we're taking more risks with our seeds. And sometimes we're really winning and getting nice red peppers late in the fall because we had a late spring. But sometimes we're also getting rot and diseases. So the soil health principles are something that we can all embody to be able to manage our relationship with the land better than we have in the past. These principles are something that I've been employing in all scales of gardening that I do, farming, etc. The first four, the top four, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are designed by the Natural Resources Conservation District, or Service rather, originally called the Soil Conservation Service after the Dust Bowl, and now called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're all really good. The fifth one was coined by one of my mentors and idols, Gabe Brown, a rancher from North Dakota. I highly recommend checking out his book, Dirt to Soil. And Slow and Sink the Water, number 6. If you follow all 5 principles, that will happen, but it's so important to change the way that we think about managing water that I like to add it to my slide of the soil health principles. And we're going to go over these as quickly as I can. This slide has a lot of words on it. And again, I'm not going to read them to you, and they will be available for future viewing. But one thing I really like to point out is the idea that soil organic matter, which is everything dead, everything partly living, everything that's falling from trees and plants and heading into the soil, along with all the bugs and the roots and the microbes, all of those things are soil organic matter. And when we have soil organic matter in our soil, it can hold 18 times its weight in water and recycle nutrients for plants to use. If you've ever seen my presentations before, you know that I get really excited about microbes. So I just gotta say it, 1 teaspoon of soil, or maybe you could say 1 tablespoon, I might have that wrong, can contain over 1 billion organisms, 75,000 species of bacteria, 10,000 protozoa, scores of nematodes, all of those are microorganisms, and a mile of fungal hyphae filaments. Those are the teeny tiny little hairs of fungus that you need a microscope to be able to see. A mile in a tablespoon, it's just incredible. And that is literally what is holding our landscapes together. That little pine sapling picture on the bottom right is showing you the pine root system of a baby pine tree. And most of what you're seeing there is actually the mycorrhizal fungus. And that is what helps to connect all sorts of plants together so that they can talk to each other. I'm sure you've heard at this point that trees can talk. And if you haven't, I highly recommend checking out the TED Talk by that name, Trees Talk. The first principle is living roots in the ground. Living roots in the ground with green growing plants on top for as long as possible. Because as those green growing plants are growing, they are nurturing photosynthesis. We saw in Lauren's presentation how photosynthesis works and why that's a very important part of our energy budget from the sun. And when we think about back to the slide of degraded landscapes, all of those places in red are places where we are no longer nurturing photosynthesis, the life force that brings all life into the soil, that creates biomass, that cycles water, that cycles nutrients, and that sustains life. When I show this slide, I always like to point out the red circle is showing you your standard lawn grass. And when we think about the potential of root systems in our soil, as indicated by the other plants on this chart, these are plants from northwestern prairies. Many of them you may recognize if you're gardeners, like the lupin and the echinacea. Some of them are specific to other regions and may not grow in Vermont, but we have similar plants here. And depending on our soil structure and the layer of bedrock where that lies underneath, we could have root systems that go all the way down to 15 feet. Lawns just don't provide that without diversity. We'll talk a little bit more about lawns later. Thinking about those root systems that we just saw going down as much as 15 feet, what we're looking at here is a really close-up view of what could happen around a root system. So the brown thing in the middle is a fine root hair. The blue area around that is indicating what we call a rhizosphere. That's an area that exists around root systems, all root systems everywhere. And as we learn more about soil microbiology and how these organisms work together, we're learning that that rhizosphere is much vaster than we thought because of the addition of mycorrhizal fungus, which is indicated by the white hairs growing in on the left and right into that area. Those are not actually roots, that is fungus. And that fungus helps plants to communicate and cycle nutrients through the soil system. The little red dots in there are indicating the billions of microorganisms that I mentioned a moment ago. Those microorganisms are fed sugars that are produced through photosynthesis from the sun and from green growing plants. And if we can continue to have green growing plants growing for as long as possible, then we're nurturing photosynthesis. We are feeding all of those organisms, creating the conditions for them to continue to proliferate, reproduce themselves, continue to cycle nutrients by producing the organic acids that they can, that dissolve sand, silt, and clay, the rock, to bring all those nutrients up to the plants themselves. This is how natural ecosystems eat. There's nobody going around with a bag of fertilizer in the forest, and the forest does really well without that. So in terms of lawns, thinking about that red circle and those tiny little root systems, that's typically what you're going to get in lawns, not only because of individual species being very few. Usually, even in a conservation mist, you might have a mix of grass seed, you might have rye, fescue, and clover, and that's certainly better than only one species. But how do we get more species into that lawn? Can we add more things? And can we pay attention to the plants that are growing in our lawn that nature is providing already there for us? I wasn't quite done there, sorry. We have more lawn just in the United States than we have many other crops in the ground. If we were to transform the way that we manage our personal lawns, we could make a big impact in the ability to cycle nutrients, increase biodiversity, increase carbon cycling, and increase water cycling, all of which will benefit all of us and all other beings on this planet. The second principle of maximize diversity, that's diversity of everything above, everything below, and as I'll get into a little later, even our diversity of thought. So maximizing diversity, I love this picture because it shows so much happening in just a square meter of soil. It's really incredible in a healthy landscape how many beings you can find evidence of in a small, small area if we simply pay attention and help to create the conditions that allow those organisms to thrive. Diversity begets diversity. Above the ground, below the ground, species, heights, textures, structure, color, timing, all of these things are important when we're thinking about our home gardens and our farm gardens and our public parks and our landscapes and our row crops and everything in between. The more diversity that we can get, the better. Timing of different flowers, different shapes of flowers, annual flowers, perennial flowers, grasses, forbs, which are basically any of the plants that aren't grasses. Lots and lots and lots of diversity, just like Mother Nature has shown us to do. Diversity below the ground is a pretty new thing to us. We don't, well, it's not new, it's just new to humans. We are just beginning to understand the dynamics of the soil food web. Soil scientists, the most amazing soil scientists that have inspired me, constantly remind me that we only know 5 to 20% of what we think there is to know about this dynamic soil food web system that feeds all of life. And one thing we do know about webs is that when you disturb one part, you disturb it all. We need all parts of our soil food web in order to function well, in order to cycle nutrients. This is just another picture to reiterate the magic of the underground. I could go on for hours and hours about this stuff. It's just so exciting to think that underneath our feet in healthy landscapes are everything that we need to be healthy and to encourage thriving ecosystems, to allow for thriving ecosystems. There's that pine picture again. I just think it's wonderful, and I wanted to share it one more time. The third principle is minimizing disturbance, or minimize disturbance. You can imagine, if you think back to the pictures I've just showed of microbes and healthy soil activity and living roots underneath the ground, supporting all of these dynamic life forms in the rhizosphere. If we send a machine like this through the ground, what is that doing to all those little organisms? So excessive tilling, use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, it kills soil life. Every time we disturb the soil, we disturb soil life. Disturbance, it is important to mention, happens naturally. We have volcanoes, we have floodings, we have all sorts of things that happen naturally. Disturbance is natural. Tilling, I'm not saying that tilling should never ever happen, but can we rethink the way that we do that so that we're not so damaging to entire ecosystems? The disturbance to insects because of chemical fertilizers and pesticides is outrageous. Of the 1 million insect species that have been identified on our planet, only 1% of those are known to be harmful to humans. And a sliver of those are actually agricultural pests. And yet we have managed to shrink the number and existence of insects. So we've shrunk the diversity of insects and the population quantities of insects everywhere around the globe. We're hearing this all over the place. And a lot of this has to do with the degradation of landscapes and the ways in which we degrade those landscapes. The downsides of conventional agriculture are many. And in terms of climate change, there's a very strong correlation between the way that we have managed our land globally for the past 150 years and even up to the last 8,000 years, but really the last 150 years, we've really managed to accelerate everything. So this slide is giving a little bit of an indication of the ways that we have disturbed things. The monarch butterfly is our sort of poster child, but that's just one of the 1 million insects that we know about. And it's a really beautiful one, but there are many others that are also critically important, that are very small, that we may never notice, that may be just as beautiful or not, but are just as important. One thing I really want to point out here is the idea that endocrine disruption is caused from continual degradation to the environment. And in this picture, it's showing pesticides. And this is something I think we all need to learn more about. How do we restore the human biome? How do we restore ecosystem biomes? And I think that we have the answers to be able to do that. And if we work together and listen well to our greatest teacher, Mother Earth, we will be able to do that. How we affect land affects, how we manage land affects carbon cycling. The top picture here is just a simple drawing showing you that when you have biomass on land, plants and animals, root masses, organisms, you have carbon cycling. Looking at those little dots, you can see on the left-hand side of the drawn picture that we have a lot more carbon cycling, a lot more carbon in the ground. And on the right side, where we have very few plants or very scraggly plants that are struggling, we have more carbon dioxide up in the air. So the carbon becomes a gas when it's not being held in life forms in biomass. On the bottom slide, that's a real life picture of a place in Karoo, South Africa. That's a famous fence line photo from the Savory Archives. That's the Alan Savory Archives. I highly recommend checking out his TED Talk that talks about holistic grazing and how that can really help to restore grasslands globally, cool the planet, cycle nutrients, and help all of us more to rehabilitate our degraded landscapes around the world. The only thing that is different on the left side of the fence as opposed to the right side of the fence on this picture is the way that animals were managed. This land looked like the right side of the picture for a very long time. You can imagine on a very hot day that if you were on the right side of the fence with bare feet, your feet would be scalding. The water is evaporating into the atmosphere. The carbon is leaving the ground and becoming carbon dioxide. There's nothing holding those cycles in. On the left side, we have carbon going in, we have water going in, and we can visually see the results of carbon and water being held in those landscapes in the form of plants. The only difference between these two sides of the fence is the way the animals were managed. On the right side, animals were allowed to roam largely, and they would eat only what they like. They would not cover the whole landscape. There's a lot to look into in terms of holistic grazing management, where on the left side, those practices were put in place. So holistic grazing management is, in a nutshell, replacing predators with fences. When we think about the buffalo or the wildebeest, or how large herds have always moved around the earth, they stayed together in large groups. They would cause disturbance as they moved through. They would eat everything but not right down to the ground. They would leave poop and pee and bits of disturbance with their hooves, and then they would move on and not come back to that place until the landscape had regenerated. And they would stay in those herd structures very close together because predators would keep them that way. Since we as a human race have taken away most of the predators, we're now finding that if we can use the ruminants that we manage as humans and replace the predators with fences, we can get a lot of the same effect on landscapes. And this regeneration took about a decade, I believe, to change, and now it's holding steady like the left side of the fence. This is something that we can do everywhere. Keeping soil covered on every scale is really important. So again, this is the second principle, or the third principle: no bare soil, keep soil covered, mimic natural systems, implement polycultures, which are just systems that have lots of different plants that work really well together. Nature provides these selections of plants for us all the time. We can pay attention to nature to find out how we can replicate these polycultures in our own gardens. Using cover cropping is really important. Living, green growing plants, covering bare soil, growing between trees like you see in the alley cropping picture. Growing between the two piles of mulch is ryegrass on the bottom left. And on the bottom right, you see ryegrass growing in a cornfield. That picture was taken in the Connecticut River Valley. In Vermont, we do have some conservation programs that are helping farmers to afford cover cropping seeds so that they can cover their soil after the corn is harvested, so that they don't continue to lose soil into the waterways and contribute to water quality issues. A lot of these solutions are happening. We need to ramp those up on every scale, from our backyards and gardens to our state parks and to our farmlands. We can rethink our urban spaces. We are starting to see more and more urban gardening, and that's really important. Some of it has to do with, yes, healthy soil and cycling carbon and cycling water, and some of it has to do with food security and food sovereignty, to have people have the ability to grow food near them. This is also aesthetically very pleasing. Air quality is improved when we have more plants. So there are lots of things that we can do. And I just want to point out the bottom left picture here is the rooftop at Fletcher Allen Hospital in Burlington, where they have a rooftop garden they've had for many years. And this particular hospital is also very focused on trying to make sure that a lot of local food comes into their cafeteria for their staff and their patients. It's an excellent example that I'd love to see spread all over the place. The fifth principle, animals in contact with the soil. So this is integrating animals into livestock systems, into natural systems. Nature always farms with animals. It doesn't matter if you're talking about microbes or chickens or humans or zebras or elephants or cows or pigs or sheep or rats. Nature always farms with animals, and there's a reason for that. And so we also should be listening and watching and mimicking that. And these small herds that you see, whether it's cows or chickens or pigs or sheep or whatever, this is all holistic grazing management, where we group animals together in larger density, stocking density than we might have thought was good. We use fences to keep them close together, and we move them often. It could be every 2 hours, every 12 hours, every 2 days, or every week, depending on lots of different ideals. So we are animals too. Humans are animals too. And I think it's really important for us to remember that in the context of this fifth principle. We need soil contact, and soil needs us. This is a cartoon drawn by my husband. Land regeneration can happen really quickly. This is a wonderful example, again, from the Savory Archives. This is in Zimbabwe, and I got this slide from my friend Seth Itzgan from Soil for Climate, who is one of the sponsors of this series. And he tells me that this is sheep and cattle country, but he suspects that it was actually the cattle that did most of the regeneration of this landscape. In 2004, on the top left, you can see that this landscape has been bare ground for decades. When a raindrop would hit that landscape, it would be like a bomb hitting the landscape. It would cause compaction. It would not soak in. It would evaporate right back out, and no water would be held. After just 1 year of using holistic grazing management practices in this landscape, annuals began to appear. The next year, with those same practices, we had a densely packed cover, and you can see in just 2 years, the way a raindrop would react in these landscapes is very different. And if you were walking on this ground with bare feet, the feeling of the heat on your feet would be very different from 2004 to 2006. Jump ahead 7 years with the same management practices, we now have deep-rooted perennials, and we have a thriving ecosystem that can manage water and carbon and provide food, not just for humans, for lots of beings. The sixth principle, slow and sink the water. Catch it, slow it, where it falls, infiltrate it in place, retain it in place. We have a habit as a species of taking rainwater and rushing it out to the ocean as quickly as we can, as if it's a problem and not a gift to be held in the soil sponge. We can learn how to redo that. This is a pretty famous slide. This is a rainfall simulator from the Natural Resources Conservation District or Conservation Service. These are available, by the way, in Vermont from the NRCS. They can bring them to your events. They can bring them to your schools if they were open. And we can learn a lot from these. And what we're looking at here are basically 5 cookie cutters of different types of land management, but the same kind of soil. So the same ratio of sand, silt, and clay in each one of those cookie cutter boxes with different land management on top. On the left side, we're looking at what I like to refer to as the soil health principles in place. We have living roots in the ground. We don't have bare soil. We have minimized disturbance. We have maximized diversity. I at least see a couple of different kinds of plants growing in there. And I'm assuming that it's a pasture, so there's animal contact with the soil, plus we know there are microbes and other critters there as well. And on the right side, we have very bare soil. There's nothing growing in it, and we're assuming that that's highly tilled soil. The jars underneath, the ones in back indicated by the green line infiltration back row of jars, is showing the water that infiltrates into the soil, just like we did in the flour and bread activity. The water infiltrated or soaked up into the soil sponge. That back row of jars is showing how much water would soak into the soil. The front jar of water is showing only runoff, how much soil we would actually lose in a rainstorm. And you can see that the bare soil all the way to the right, the color of the water in that front jar is very, very dark. It's full of soil. We had 100% runoff and 0 infiltration in the back jar. And on the left side, exactly the opposite. We had 100% infiltration into the back jar. The color of the water is fairly clear, and the front jar does not have any runoff. Schoolyard flooding in July, just like the climate and agriculture folks at UVM say, we're going to continue to get more rain. larger rains, if we do not allow for that water to soak into our sponge, we're just essentially sending it off to our ocean dead zones. That little map on the bottom right is showing a pretty recent map of ocean dead zones globally. There's a lot that we can do to change this in our culture, and it's up to every one of us to do that. I've been working with 6th graders at Thetford Elementary School for a number of years doing soil science, using protocols that were designed by Dee Purshouse and Land and Leadership and the Soil Carbon Coalition to teach about soil science, water infiltration, a bit about soil microbiology and composting. These students are beginning to understand how we can better manage water in the landscape at school to be able to grow more food and get through drought periods without using too much water from our school system. The 6th graders at this school manage our compost. They make all the deposits, they monitor the compost, the data they collect is tied to their curriculum. 5th graders turn the compost, and the finished compost becomes a place where we can grow lots of pumpkins at our school because we grow more compost than we have gardens for it. So I'm getting to my closing now, and I think I've done a pretty good run through of the soil health principles. I'd love to get more into that in our question and answer session. And I just want to leave you with some ideas here that soil health and soul health are the same. If we're not taking care of our soil and we're not taking care of our souls, we're going to have a hard time moving forward through these challenging times. So I would like to ask you all to think about what are your soul health principles and how can we embody the soil health principles to determine the practices by which we are going to interface with land on this planet, and how can we implement our soul health principles so that we can inform ourselves a better practice of how we interact with one another, all beings, not just humans. As we get into our discussion period, I would like to encourage everyone to think about asking better questions. Reflect thinking on whole systems. The image on the right here is the elephant in the room. This was designed by Peter Donovan, one of my colleagues and mentors from the Soil Carbon Coalition. And I think it's self-explanatory, but just in case, I'll just say, you know, we could focus a lot on disease. We could focus a lot on scarcity conflicts and climate change and weeds and which plant is better to do this and which one is better to do that and how do I do this very specific thing. And all of those may be very important questions. But until we look at the whole system of climate change, the whole system of how Earth works, the whole system of how humans interact with one another and in what relation we live with the land, we're never going to get to be where we need to be. So let us think in whole systems. Let us not allow ourselves to get stuck by bad questions. Let's ask better questions, and let's help each other to learn how to do that. We have lots of opportunities ahead of us. If we work together, which we are, we're building that social mycelium. It's strengthening every day. I'm so grateful to be a part of it. And I know that we can do this. We can adapt, we can change our behaviors. We can live in alignment with natural systems. We can make the fundamental changes from social culture to agriculture to address and mitigate climate change as a whole systems challenge. We can live in right relation to the land. Humans can allow for the rehabilitation of global land surfaces and the liberation of all living beings. We can do a lot by the way we grow food. We can do a lot by the way we support our community. And we can do a lot by the eating choices that we make. Thank you very much.